Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately and we will ensure interpretation is properly restored before resuming the proceedings. The raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen can be used at any time if you wish to speak or alert the chair. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. Keep in mind the Board of Internal Economy's guidelines for mask use and health protocols. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled as normal by the proceeding and verification officer. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. And you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. As today is our first visitor to our committee, I would just like to reiterate that rule. So I would appreciate if all comments by members and witnesses are addressed through the chair. With regards to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do our best that we can to consolidate the order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually in person. And I understand that we have speaking orders for all parties. Perfect. I would now like to welcome our witness, Mr. Marion Dion, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. He will be with us for up to 90 minutes. Then the committee will move to in-camera to conduct some committee business. Mr. Dion, we appreciate you sharing your opening statements with us in both official languages, and I would now ask that you please proceed with your opening statement. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, Chairperson. Tout d'abord, merci au comité de m'avoir.
To begin with, thank you for inviting me to come speak to you today on the matter of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioners work with the Conflict of Interest Code for members of the House of Commons to help us look over the basis of the code and how it works. I've been the Commissioner for about 4 years now as part of a 7-year term under the Parliament of Canada Act. As an officer of the House of Commons, I am solely responsible to Parliament and not to the federal government or any individual minister. I believe in the role we have in helping improve the confidence of Canadians and their elected officials and public sector leaders. At our office, we provide advice and direction. That's our first task. Secondly, we investigate when needed. And third, we help educate through a variety of private and public forums.
In 2004, and has been modified the last time in 2015, within the cadre of the exhaustive review provided for at Section 33 of the Code. My primary role and that of the office is to provide members of Parliament with the assistance needed to understand and follow the code on an ongoing basis. It is their responsibility to follow the code. It is our role to assist them in making sure that they do follow the code. At times, the assistance provided is more rules-based, as is the case now with the initial compliance process. We are busy working with each of the 338 MPs to complete the initial compliance process. This process is outlined in the code at sections 20 and 21 and commences when your election, each MP's election, is published in the Canada Gazette. We also undertake broader educational programs as per section 32 of the code. There is an obligation in the code for me to make sure that we provide educational services to both MPs, but also to the public. And we build on we try to create an internal jurisprudence, if you wish, that we share on during those educational sessions and in providing advice as well to members, individual members, and members of their staff. So as set out in the preamble, the code's purpose, because it's important to always remember the purpose of the code. It's not an end in itself, but the purpose is to maintain and enhance public confidence. Demonstrate to the public that the standards the MPs are held to are being applied, and to make sure that you get the assistance you need to reconcile. That's the crux, to reconcile your private interests with your public duties. So I strongly believe that Canadians should receive as much information as possible to ensure that elected and appointed officials are held accountable. That's why we have the public registry maintained by the office. So once your disclosure statement for Section 23 will have been prepared, your information will be listed in the registry. And any Canadian at any time, 24/7, will be able to go and look at each particular MP, their own MP or any MP, to determine the state of their assets, liabilities, outside activities, and so on and so forth. So nevertheless, so I guess my overall assessment after 4 years working with the code is that the code is working. The code is not broken. There are situations where some people, including our office, would wish the code would say something different, but they are very few and far apart. So so when we are here to basically assist the committee in seeing how we can contribute to the comprehensive review, if the committee decides to conduct a comprehensive review, and to also to answer any question that you may have. It's important that we work together. My role is to assist you, to assist the House of Commons, to assist every MP. And it's important that we ensure that the manner in which we carry out our duties is in line with the needs of the MPs. Donc, Madame la Présidente, mon objectif n'est pas ici de vous décrire.
So, Madam Chair, my aim here is not to go through all the obligations of the MPs and the details of our office procedures, but to participate in a useful dialogue. It will therefore be my pleasure to answer questions put to me by the members of your committee regarding the code and how we function.
I understand now, based on the motions that we had passed, each party will have 6 minutes in the opening round, starting with Mr. Broussard. Mr. Broussard, to you the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dion, for being here today. I will admit that in my new role as ethics and accountable government critic, I Googled your name, and you've been extremely busy over the last 4 years. One of the things that you've talked about is the review of the code. As you know, the last time the code was reviewed, as is a requirement under Section 33, was in 2015. You've been here for 4 years. In your opinion, we're coming up to 7 years now. Do you believe, is it your opinion that a review of the code is required at this point?
Through the chair, Mr. Broussard.
Thank you,
Mr. Dion, the floor is yours.
I think Section 33 is clear. The wording is unequivocal, and there should have been a comprehensive review as early as 2020, and it has not yet been conducted.
Mr. Broussard?
Thank you. So is it of your opinion that that review is required at this point, notwithstanding the requirements of the code? In your opinion, as the Ethics Commissioner, is that required right now?
I don't believe you want my opinion. So
sorry,
once again,
Madam
we will
Chair.
go through the chair.
Through the chair, I'm
Mr.
asking.
Dion?
Thank you.
So if the member wants to know my opinion about whether in the absolute review is required, in my view, a review is not required at this point. The code is working. There are no situations where we are prevented from doing what is right, what is in keeping with the objectives of the code because of a loophole, because of an obstacle in the code. So a review is not required at this point in time, although Section 33 seems to mandate one at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Dion. Through you, Madam Chair, Mr. Dion mentioned in his opening remarks that there are some things, there are some other things that not just his staff, but he would like to see as part of the code. If there were to be a review of the code, what changes would Mr. Dion like to see enhanced within the code and administered within the code?
Mr. Dion?
So, Madam Chair, since I've accepted the position 4 years ago, I have been keeping a list of my own with some of my staff of things that we will put forward to the committee if and when a review takes place. So we do have a few things. I don't think it would be appropriate for me this morning to start, because I have to start naming such examples, because I would really like to explain it well in a document that I would table with the committee in short order should a review be initiated. I do have ideas. I'll maybe give a couple of examples if that's useful to the committee, but I don't think it would be appropriate for me to name them all because the list is not up to date. It has not been revised since COVID because we've been busy doing other things. So I would like to have a few weeks to update it and to properly present suggestions to the committee.
Mr. Dion, Mr. Broussard has signaled that he would like a couple suggestions.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll pick a couple of easier ones. They're all, so for example, in my view, the committee should, and the House of Commons should consider including modifying the code so that friends are included in the prohibition against a member furthering private interests. Currently, it's only relatives, members of the family that are included as people that you cannot favor. Unlike the Conflict of Interest Act, which clearly indicates that friends are in the same category as members of the family. So that's one suggestion. I also would suggest that we have a minimum threshold for acceptability of gifts. So if a gift is worth less than an amount to be decided by the House of Commons, such as $25 or $30 or $40, that we do not collectively waste our time trying to analyze whether such a gift is acceptable given its minimal value. So those are two examples of the things that would appear in my list.
Thank you,
So as
Mr.
you can
Dion.
see there, sorry.
Do you want more? Yeah,
How much time have I got?
15.
Thank you. And those are two perfect examples, Mr. Dion, of why a review of the code is required. And certainly at this committee, I'm sure the members look forward to engaging with you further on that. One of the things that you talked about is public confidence, making sure that we have public confidence. In your 4 years in your position, have you either seen an erosion of public confidence given some of the circumstances that have occurred with respect to the Conflict of Interest Act, or is that public confidence at the same level in which you started?
Mr. Dion, the last 35 seconds will be yours.
As you know, Madam Chair, there have been several polls conducted in Canada and abroad during the period in question, and there is no question that there is a decline in public confidence according to these polls, not only attributable to the code or to the Conflict of Interest Act, but to generally the confidence that people have in their governments, both in Canada and abroad as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull, the floor is now yours for 6 minutes, please, through the chair.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and just would like to say welcome to Mr. Dion to PROC. It's nice to finally meet you. And through you, Madam Chair, I would ask Mr. Dion a series of questions. I think from my perspective, there's probably 3 or 4 areas that I'd like to hopefully touch on if I have the time. One is, Mr. Dion, through you, Madam Chair, I'd like to ask you about the educational function and part of your role, which to me is, I think, extremely important. I know in some of the past work done at this committee, there was talk when Ms. Dawson, I think, was in your position about guidelines and about how PROC actually had to approve guidelines. Could you maybe speak to how you think guidelines might assist in interpreting the code, and whether you have prepared any guidelines for just to help members of Parliament? As we know, ethics it can be challenging in moments where you have conflicting duties. Ethical dilemmas are commonplace, I would say, in our work. They arise often, and I think having guidelines is often very useful for members of Parliament.
Mr. Dion?
Madam Chair, I would agree. I think it would be useful to have guidelines, and we will be pleased to draft and table for discussion such guidelines if that's the wish of the committee on a variety of subjects. But I suggest that we should only do that once we've determined whether any changes would be made to the code, so that the guidelines actually reflect the code as amended, if it is amended after the comprehensive review.
Mr. Turnbull?
And through you, Madam Chair, I'd like to just ask a follow-up about whether PROC is still mandated to approve those guidelines within the code itself. Is that the case? And would that be something that you would be seeking to change, which seems a little bit onerous for someone in your position that's dealing with, is basically looking at the many questions that come up with interpreting the code. I'm sure you get lots of calls. Would that be something you'd be interested in trying to waive, which is the approval that PROC would need to actually approve those guidelines?
Clearly through the chair, Mr. Dion.
So the code currently requires that the guidelines be tabled with the committee and be approved by the committee. And at section 30 sub 2, it says that any guidelines, so I cannot issue guidelines unless they're approved by the committee, and they have to be reported to the House of Commons. And they only come into effect once the report has been concurred in by the House. And it further goes on to say that until the guidelines and forms are reported to the House, they shall remain confidential. So I cannot even talk about guidelines or say anything about guidelines until such time as they have been reported to the House.
Well, I certainly would like to register my interest in seeing guidelines produced in the future at some point, but I'm sure we can have discussions as a committee about that and see what the will of the committee is. But certainly I feel like they're necessary, and I feel like Mr. Dion, your office in your role is probably receiving all kinds of inquiries on a regular basis about how to interpret the code. I know I've used the office quite a few times to ask questions when they've arisen, and I'm sure other members do the same. I wanted to ask you, through the chair, about where you feel additional guidance is most merited based on the volume of inquiries that you get.
Mr. Dion?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a somewhat difficult one because it fluctuates with time. That's why it's difficult. There used to be a time where the key issue was gifts, acceptability of gifts. Since COVID, people don't go anywhere, do not get any gifts. So therefore, gifts is not much of an issue at this point in time. The key issue today is the notion of significant change. When is a change significant enough for the duty to inform my office to arise? It's vague in most members' mind, and we don't have the authority to set parameters, except to say that they have to be material changes. Material means something that affects the initial statement that was published on the registry. But, does a change of $10 in one's mortgage constitute a significant change? I don't think so. Where is the line? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? Is it 100,000? That's topic number one. Topic number two, letters of support. Many members inquire about letters of support. What can I say? Which stationery should be on? And so on and so forth. So we could have a guideline on that as well. There are several subjects like that. But the order of it appears that the prevalence is around the issue of significant change, letters of support mostly, and gifts still to some extent.
Thank you, Mr. Dion. Mr.
Thank you very much for that answer. That's very helpful. From my perspective, I subscribe to values-based ethics, which is more about building character. And I think ethics is more of a practice than it is about just sheer compliance. Of course, compliance is very important. But what I would like to see, there's several ethicists that are world-renowned that talk about ethics as developing situational awareness and situational intelligence, and really looking at case studies and doing training is really important. Mr. Dion, through you, Madam Chair, would you agree with that more training is required?
I will give Mr. Dion a brief moment to answer.
Madam Chair, without the shadow of a doubt, I wish MPs would take more time to participate in training we currently offer, in addition to more sophisticated training such as the one mentioned by the member.
Well, good news, Santa is listening. Monsieur Thérion, maintenant à vous la parole. Et...
Mr. Thérion, over to you, and the comments through the chair, please. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good day, Mr. Dion, and thank you for being here with us today. I have a few questions. You mentioned the definition of family and family members, and including friends. as possibly being covered by a prohibition against members favoring their private interests, something that could incur sanctions by your office. So I'm intrigued by this. When Mr. Trudeau spoke of We Charity and his mother's involvement in it, at one point he said, "My mother is not a member of my family." Now, what I understood from that was he was speaking of himself, his wife, and his children, his immediate family. Is that correct? Is that an appropriate definition? My mother, my father, are they not members of my family? Under the code, and here, of course, we are dealing with the code and not the law in general. There's quite a difference. Mr. Trudeau and all ministers and members of parliament are covered by the code and by the law, of course, but the family is one's partner and dependent children. Those of less than 18 years of age or who are financially dependent on you, even though they're older than 18. Thank you, Mr. Terrien. That's fine. It's just an intriguing situation. I was wondering about it. You're speaking of revising the code and perhaps including friends in the definition. So should the interpretation or definition of family be reviewed, be re-examined? Perhaps mother or father could be added? Or is this current situation suitable as far as you're concerned? I'm sorry, Madam Chair. There are provisions in the code which prevent any member from favoring in an unusual fashion any person. But the test is a little tighter when it comes to dealing with family members. So basically, we're speaking of the basic family, the immediate family. But when it comes to friends, that's something I'm concerned about because one might favor a friend much as one might favor one's son or one's wife or Mr. Terrien? Well, I would suggest, is a favorable thought, that a friend is someone who might influence my behavior and not thinking that a father or mother might influence my behavior, my choices. That seems a little problematic. Mr. Dion. Well, if the committee were to look into issues, this is the sort of thing they might wish to spend some time on. There are many issues, of course, that might merit their attention, but this is an example that I gave you of something that the committee or a committee might wish to address. Mr. Terrien, at the Bloc Québécois, we would have preferred ensuring that the ethics commissioner have a little more power, because in the SNC-Lavalin matter, there was blameworthy behavior, and, well, that was the case. Do you think that you should have more clout based on the decisions you make so that you can have a really dissuasive effect on Parliament? Mr. Dion. Madam Chair, we're here this morning to discuss the code. That's an important topic, and it is a constitutional threshold, barrier, but only Parliament may impose sanctions. Parliament can do so. I can recommend a type of sanction, that a sanction should be taken out against a member, but it's up to the Parliament to decide whether or not to proceed in that way. As for the law, that's another matter. The law doesn't even allow me to make recommendations about sanctions. My role is a limited one. I can analyze the facts and share my conclusions with the Prime Minister. That's where it stops. Could I go further? Well, perhaps in a review of the code, but that's another matter for another committee. That's exactly, Mr. Terrien. You have questions? Yes, that is my question, whether or not you should have more clout and whether the current legislation allows for that and whether parliamentarians should come together to change the law to ensure that you would be able to play a more punitive, a more dissuasive role in situations that require this type of clout. And I think that we're kind of missing the boat when we see you making decisions, sharing opinions and thoughts that seem to lead nowhere, that have no consequences for members. So how much time do I have left? 58 seconds. Very well. So the procedures, the functioning, Of course, we are working with concepts, and as we know in social sciences, you try to choose the right concepts so that your actions will be more relevant to reality. And I see here that it is forbidden to any public office holder to make decisions within the exercise of their duties if they know or should reasonably know that by making this decision they could put themselves in a conflict of interest. Do you think that we could improve the way that is conceptualized? Mr. Dion, you have 15 seconds. Very well, Madam Chair. Everything can be improved, of course. All of the clauses of the code, and I have some suggestions for that, as I do on a number of topics. Thank you, Mr. Dion.
Pass it over to Ms. Blaney. 6 minutes to yourself. Remind all members that observations, comments do go through the chair. I look forward to a very productive committee, and I think it's important that we set that tone here. Ms. Blaney, to you the floor.
Well, thank you for that reminder, Chair. And through you, I would like to thank Mr. Dion for the incredible work that he and his staff provide. I appreciate the work and understand that these are very complex issues, and I can imagine some of the very interesting questions this office must receive. I'm just wondering, through you, Madam Chair, if Mr. Dion could speak to the realities that he faces as an employer, and if he feels that his office has the sufficient resources to do the work that the office is tasked with.
Mr. Dion?
Madam Chair, when I started in the position, that's one of the first things I looked at. I looked at budget and complement, and we have asked for a small increase in our budget and complement since I came to the position in 2018. And I feel we currently have enough to carry out our role fully in the manner I would like to see it carried. There is no lack of resources at this point in time to meet the challenge.
Ms. Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair, and through you, I thank Mr. Dion for that response. One of the things that I found compelling about some of the conversation that I heard today is the idea of training and members using the access to training that's provided. So one of the questions that I have for Mr. Dion, through you, Madam Chair, is we know, and we've just gone through this, the recent time of onboarding where new MPs are introduced to the House of Commons and educated in so many different ways. I'm just wondering if Mr. Dion feels that there's enough resources in place and enough training for new members as they are onboarded into this new experience.
Mr. Dion?
Madam Chair, I'm afraid I don't know enough about the program offered by the House of Commons to pass any judgment, except insofar as conflict of interest is concerned, which is my subject area. We will, in February, we will participate to a program at the House of Commons for MPs on the topic. It's good, it will be general, but I think we have to go further, and I have already started to offer specialized sessions on topics, specific topics for members of Parliament and their staff, but not all their staff. I think members should take a few minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, to inform themselves about key subject matters such as recusal, for instance, about Section 6 that the member was talking about earlier, about as opposed to a general overview of the code. I think it's important to stop and look at the most frequently used provisions, if you wish, to develop the reflex to make it part of your normal practice to think about these things. So there isn't enough from my point of view, and I would like to offer much more. And we've already started to do that. If you look at our successive annual reports, we're doing more and more.
Ms. Blaney?
So, Madam Chair, I would like to ask Mr. Dion, through you, to clarify something. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this, so that when an MP is newly elected, goes through the training that, of course, covers a wide range of issues, is Mr. Dion's department part of that? Is there a section, and yes, is that fulsome enough, or does Mr. Dion want that expanded in the onboarding process? That would help me greatly.
Mr. Dion?
Yes, Madam Chair, I would like to see it expanded. I think we should have more time and we should have more attendees as well. I was quite concerned about the low attendance at the recent session we offered for newly elected MPs.
Oh, that's interesting.
Blaney?
Well, Madam Chair, thank you for that. That's very helpful. So I guess the next question that I have for Mr. Dion through you, Madam Chair, is, I heard clearly that the training isn't accessed as much. So I'm just wondering, should there be a process where not only new MPs are sort of put into that frame where they are learning, and I really heard what Mr. Dion said about that automatic reference point within your brain. If you're educated on something enough, as soon as you have something exposed to you right away, you think of that and how meaningful it would be to have that automatic connection, but we don't necessarily see it. So I'm wondering, through you, Madam Chair, if members that have been around, should there be refresher courses, and how could this place better engage members with participating?
Mr. Dion?
One potential solution, it's never a solution, but some training could be made mandatory. That would be one approach. It could be a number of, a small number. We're not talking about big investment. We're talking about maybe 10 hours at best, over the course of a year and a half or something like that. But the training should be mandatory so that people actually do attend and listen. We are still getting some, we're getting a good proportion of the advice that is sought is what I refer to usually as 101, really 101, very, very, very basic. And I don't mind getting those requests for advice, but I'm always surprised that a member of parliament would not know something so fundamental, so elementary, if you wish. So training is a way to develop that.
Ms. Blaney, 25 seconds.
Well, I thank you for that, through you, Madam Chair. And I know that members of Parliament are being asked to take certain types of training, so I just really want to hope that this committee heard the mandatory request that you just made. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Mr. Dion, did you want to make a quick comment?
Well, I think that's it, Madam Chair, on the topic of training, and we'll see if it comes up again.
Excellent. We are entering our 5-minute rounds, and we'll be starting with Mr. Broussard through the chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to pick up on some of the comments that Mr. Dion finished with in my first interaction with him, and as it relates to public confidence. And he cited several opinion polls that show that public confidence has eroded. I would suggest that there's further erosion in that public confidence when situations arise, Mr. Dion, where, for example, sole source contracts, untendered contracts are given, understanding that there is a distinction between the Act and the Code. Is there anything in the Code that you would suggest needs to be changed to address that type of situation that could, in fact, restore public confidence?
Mr. Dion?
Madam Chair, frankly, I have not seen any situation where the issue of awarding of contracts and the code have had much of an interaction, because usually contracts are awarded by government, not by members of parliament. And the government, the members of the government who are involved in awarding contracts are governed by the Conflict of Interest Act, and they do take appropriate measures. We review their situation, each of them separately upon appointment, to ensure that we minimize the risk of a conflict of interest. And I'm quite satisfied with the measures that are being taken at this point in time on a case-by-case basis. There could always be situations, of course, that fall between the cracks, but I'm not aware of any at this point in time.
Mr. Broussard?
I want to move on then to the expansion of family and friends under the code. We saw in the Ratansi report, for example, where Ms. Ratansi thought of a member of her family as being a friend. Would you consider an expansion of that definition as part of a review or a potential review, not just family and friends, but in those particular situations as well?
Clearly through the
Yes,
chair, Mr. Dion?
Sorry, Madam Chair. I think we ought to look at who is the nucleus that constitutes a member's most influential, the people that are the closest to a member. That's the issue. So we have a spouse, obviously. We have children. Well, should we include other people? And if so, who are those other people? And it's one of several issues that could be raised as part of a review of the code.
Mr. Broussard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In terms of interacting with police forces, whether it's the RCMP. Just walk me through the process of how you, when you receive an indication that there might be a violation in the code, at what point would you approach the police in a circumstance to get them involved?
Mr. Dion?
In fact, there are provisions, Madam Chair, right in the code mandating certain things when it comes to whenever my work interacts or intersects with the work of law enforcement. Section 29 says that the commissioner shall immediately suspend, so I have no discretion, the inquiry into a matter if there are reasonable grounds to believe that the member has committed an offense under an act of parliament, in which case the commissioner shall notify the proper authorities of the commissioner's belief. And if it is this also, I have to stop and cease and desist immediately if it's discovered that the act or omission under investigation is also the subject of an investigation by a law enforcement authority, or if a charge has been laid. So those three situations, I have to stop. And that's what we did in the Gruwald situation. Gruwald, 3 years ago, I had to basically suspend when we were informed that there was an investigation and now charges have been laid. It's an example. There was also the Carson matter a few years ago where the same thing happened in the investigation being conducted by Ms. Dawson. So that's how it works, Madam Chair.
50 seconds to you, Mr. Broussard.
Madam, excuse me, Madam Chair. My next question revolves around proactive consultation with your department. I've recently become aware of a former senior aide to the Finance Minister, Freeland, who announced that he's accepted a new job at the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Anil Jaswal said his mandate is to include deploying $35 billion in taxpayer money to various projects around the country. Were you consulted before Mr. Jaswal accepted this position?
15 seconds to you, Mr. Dion. The final
So,
time.
Madam Chair, any discussion we have with any public office holder or any MP is confidential, and I am mandated both under the code and the act to make sure I never talk about that. So I'm not at liberty to say whether we were consulted, and so that's the way it is. And I frankly don't remember whether we were consulted in any event, because we are consulted often.
Thank you, Mr. Dion. 5 minutes now to Ms. Ramanado, through the chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Dion, pour votre présence.
Thank you, Mr. Dion, for being present here this morning.
In speaking about confidentiality, Article 23.3 of the Conflict of Interest Code clearly says that the Commissioner shall keep any statements confidential, so whether it be initial disclosures or change in material change. Could the Commissioner outline protocols used by his office to ensure that all information provided by members of Parliament are kept confidential?
Mr. Dion?
So the first measure that comes to mind is the fact that each and every employee at the office, without exception, has the secret security clearance, without any exception. Secondly, we use the networks provided to us by the House of Commons, and we're assured that they are extremely secure, encrypted. So that's the second measure. The third measure is that we have a registry that is locked, basically, requires a magnetic card. We also have 24/7 coverage by the House Security Service to make sure that there is no intrusion in the office. And thirdly, we have a clear policy as well that employees should only consult the file on a need-to-know basis.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I know that in a previous case, it was indicated that a breach did occur with respect to this requirement where documentation was sent to an MP's generic MP account, whereas staff had full access to this information. Has this occurred in the past? How often does this occur? And could the Commissioner advise us not only if this has happened in the past, but does he have to report these kind of breaches? And if so, what is the oversight mechanism to make sure that these kind of errors don't happen again? Thank you.
Mr. Dion?
So, Madam Chair, the example quoted by the member is actually the only example I am aware of in the last 4 years where an email was misdirected, but it was still sent to an account that belongs to that MP. It was not sent to a third party. It was not sent outside of government, outside of the House of Commons, but to instead of the P9 account, it was sent to another account. And we apologized for that. So this is the only instance. We don't have to report it. We're not governed by the Privacy Act, unlike departments and agencies. There is no obligation to report any privacy situation. But in this one, I don't believe there was a privacy situation because the account belongs to the MP. So.
Ms. Romanetto?
Okay, with respect to that, in all honesty, I think the information that I'm providing to the Ethics Commissioner and his office regarding my assets and liabilities, including that of my spouse, should not be seen by my staff. If I wanted my staff to see it, I would have made sure they had it. But I want to move now along to some of the politicization of his office in terms of Section 27.21. In the event there is a request for to look into a situation where it is clear that there was no breach or the MP did not break the code. It says very clearly that in 27.6 that there are consequences for frivolous reports. Have there ever been any frivolous reports in the last 4 years with respect to inquiries in terms of members being sanctioned for reporting non-meritorious requests?
Mr. Dion?
So, Madam Chair, the answer is twofold. I think we have not had any frivolous, what I would consider to be a frivolous or vexatious request made by any MP in the last 4 years, and therefore we've had no situation where somebody was reprimanded for that.
Thank you very much for clarifying, Monsieur Dion. And last but not least, you did bring up a question regarding gifts. I am probably one of the members of Parliament that is most frequently in contact with your office to, on a monthly basis, report any gifts that I receive, even the smallest amounts. Is there another option for members of Parliament in terms of tracking gifts? Because as the gift policy says very clearly that the amount is under $200 or within a calendar year if it exceeds the $200 amount. But however, we never know what we're going to receive in a given year. So is there a better way that we can be tracking that to make sure that we're not submitting constant updates to your office? And I know I'm out of time. Thank you.
Brief answer to yourself, Mr. Dion.
So, Madam Chair, another possible topic for discussion under comprehensive review. But at the present time, you have, I think it's 30 days to report any gift valued at more than $200, or which combined with other gifts would cause the total value to increase above 200. That's the way it is at this point. That's how we have to enforce the code.
Merci, Mr. Dion. Et donc, on commence les rondes de 2 minutes et demie.
Thank you, Mr. Dion. We will now go to our 2.5-minute rounds. Mr. Terrien, please. Thank you, Madam Chair. With regard to gifts, you are thinking of, I'm sorry, perhaps it was stated, but I just didn't catch it, but you're thinking of raising the total amount to make it easier for everyone to manage this? Madam Chair, I don't think I quite said that. No, I'm sorry, that's not what I said. I mean, I don't want to repeat something that has already been said, but I'm simply interested. I'd like to know. Madam Chair, I think that the current limit of $200 and more is quite adequate. It was changed in 2015. It had been set at $500, and some 7 years ago, the committee decided to choose $200 as a limit instead, as in the Act. In my opening remarks, I did suggest that this might be examined. It is somewhat unacceptable, even absurd, to think that an MP might be influenced by a gift worth, I'm not sure, maybe less than $30, of such a low value. A lot of time is spent discussing these small gifts, and perhaps a minimal amount could be set. Well, I'm not sure, and I speak through the chair, of course. So, Madam Chair, at Section 2, we speak of accepting gifts and other advantages. I would like to ask Mr. Thion, Madam Chair, what is meant by other advantages. Gift, that's clear enough, but what is meant by other advantages? Mr. Dion. Well, it's quick enough and easy enough because the word is interpreted in the code at Section 3. It's the third interpretation stating that any sum of money, if someone gives you a sum of money, that's the clear amount, example, cash or otherwise, any service, any use of a good or money, let's say using a condo, or someone allows you to use a condo worth $200 a night for $100 a night. That's an advantage, something that is provided to you at a value under its commercial value. That's what an advantage is. You are profiting. You are paying less than what someone else would have to pay to get the same service or good. Is that all? Yes, I'm afraid so. Thank you, Mr. Dion, then. Yes, you may. Ms. Blaney, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again for this interesting conversation with Mr. Dion today. Just to go back to my other questions around training, what I was wondering is there like a handbook for members? I apologize for not knowing this off the top of my head, but I'm just wondering, is there something that provides something, especially when they're a new member, that they receive that orients them? And just listening to the conversation today, Madam Chair, I couldn't help but reflect on how many websites where they have the frequently asked questions, and you know, Mr. Dion talked about having to sort of answer these questions repeatedly. I understand that's a lot of work. I'm just wondering if there is a place where we can gather this information, and if that is a gap within the services provided for MPs.
Mr. Dion?
So, Madam Chair, we do have a website, and it does contain information that would be useful to members of Parliament. But the manner in which the code is currently constructed tells us essentially that I have no authority to talk about any issue unless I can do so in it's Section 26 of the code that prohibits me from publicizing any advice that is sought and any advice that's given. Except if I do so in a manner that doesn't reveal the circumstances and the member who asked me the question. So we used to have information notices on our website, which at the suggestion of our legal services, we removed because we were not in a position to actually prove that each of those information notices and everything in each information notice was the result of a request having been made by an MP in the past. So that's the box we're in, essentially. And earlier during our discussion, we spoke about guidelines. Guidelines are different. We could table guidelines, propose guidelines, which once approved by the committee and referred to the House of Commons, would be useful to MPs, would tell them more about their obligations under the code. But without the committee's approval, I cannot proceed and publish anything of this nature.
Ms. Blaney, 20 seconds.
Well, through you, Madam Chair, with just 20 seconds, I just want to thank Mr. Dion for the impossibleness of this task at time, and hopefully I get another round. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we go back into 5 minutes, starting with Mr. Culkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to Mr. Dion. I have some questions in regards to whether or not the committee should actually undergo the statutory mandated review. You indicated, I believe, in your early testimony that you thought the code was working well, yet a number of questions have arisen here from my colleagues around the table suggesting that there is some concern about clarity. And I would re-ask the question based on the questions that you've received so far from my colleagues. Madam Chair, does the Commissioner believe that perhaps a review is actually warranted and that this committee will likely be deliberating whether or not we're going to go down that path based on your advice? Do you wish to give us any more clarity on what your thoughts would be in updating the code?
Mr. Dion?
Yes, Madam Chair, I've just thought about this. So a review, in my view, is not essential. A review is certainly warranted because there are a number of areas that we could look at. And of course, it's for the committee to determine its priorities, whether reviewing the code is more important than some important work that you might have to address as well during the session that just begun. So it's not for me, but it's not essential, and it certainly would be useful, however, to do a review, and the code mandates one in any event under Section 33, as it's written.
Mr. Calkins?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Commissioner has said quite a bit in regards to family and friends, and has even addressed the issue when questioned about handing over investigations to police. I am concerned a little bit, and I wonder about the nature of relationships, because the role of being a member of Parliament is a complicated one, and it's one that I think is best understood by those who've held the role. Your job is to try and pass judgment on those of us who hold this role, and to keep us in line according to the rules that we ourselves make. But I am concerned about the roles of growing influence, friendships, through the guise of friendships, not necessarily family, that foreign state influence might actually have. And I'm wondering if your office has given any consideration to any changes or amendments to the code where somebody might be using gifts or influence or some other type of furtherance of benefit to a member of Parliament, or might even be an agent themselves of a foreign government to put in place in our democracy. Have you given any considerations to that?
Mr. Dion?
Not in a very important way, because we have not come across many situations where the test for gifts is influence. So whether it's domestic, foreign, it's still inappropriate to accept a gift if it can be seen as having been given to you in order to influence you in your judgment, in your public duties. So, but we have frankly not come across many situations where there was a foreign element to gift giving. But it would equally apply, whether it's domestic or foreign.
Mr. Calkins?
Commissioner, then the bottom line, or the line in the sand of the $200, $500 thresholds that we've talked about, don't necessarily need the perception of a quid pro quo arrangement. Is that correct?
Mr. Dion?
No, the issue is the code is very clear on that. If it can lead a reasonable person to believe that it was given. So there's no need to prove an absolute quid pro quo.
Mr. Calkins?
Thank you. Do you believe that there should be a quid pro quo, or do you believe the reasonable perception is good enough?
Clearly through the chair.
Of course, at all
Mr.
times,
Dion?
Madam Chair.
Based on the 4 years of experience, Madam Chair, I believe the test is perfectly good the way it is.
Mr. Calkins?
I do have a question in regards to the process that is currently being followed. As a returning member of Parliament now several times, and I believe that everybody here at the table, well, not right now, well, yes, even now, is a returning member of Parliament. Sorry, Eric. He's just so young. Madam Chair, one of the things that I think some colleagues around the table may find not necessarily frustrating, but an exercise in maybe not the best use of time. When an election is called, all of the information that you have about us is considered gone, null, and void. And if we've just submitted our annual declaration to you, we simply have to go through the process again a few months after having an election.
Thank you, Mr.
Do you
Calkins.
see a way we can streamline that and make that better?
Mr. Dion will give you a moment to respond.
Madam Chair, my answer always is we unfortunately have to apply the code the way it is crafted, and at this point in time, this is required to submit a new statement as if you were a brand new member of Parliament. We could certainly look at the minimum period of time. It has to be in not real time, but it has to be recent. So is the line 6 months, 9 months, 3 months? I don't know. And it would be for the committee to review as part of the comprehensive review.
Thank you, Mr. Dion. 5 minutes, starting with Ms. Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I was just wondering if Mr. Dion, and first and foremost, I'd like to thank him for always being available and present for this committee. I know you had made an offer even in the last Parliament, to be present if the committee undertook a review of the code. The committee at that time, I guess, was busy with other matters and was not able to get to the code. So we might be doing that this time around. And I wanted to just go back to some of the common questions that you had referred to earlier, and that the fact that you were surprised that members were still, having questions about this. I don't think it should come as a surprise, quite frankly. Oftentimes when members talk amongst themselves, there is a lot of confusion. And even in the past, in the 44th Parliament, we had, in the 43rd Parliament, we had Ms. Dawson come before this committee, and there were many questions asked quite pointedly to Ms. Dawson where there were no clear answers, and most of them were surrounding gifts and how to report them. I feel your position today has been a little bit more clear. So could you go into some more detail without naming members of specific cases that you encounter often, that it might be, not intentional, but just due to lack of knowledge?
Mr. Dion?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The issue of gift, point one, nothing happens until we find out that somebody has accepted a gift. So it's typically 95% of the time, it's the member tells us that he or she has accepted a gift. We can also, from time to time, find out in social media, for instance, that the member has accepted a gift, and it has happened in practice, but usually the member self-declares. And our role is to determine whether the gift was acceptable. If it was accepted, was it acceptable? And the test is, as I've mentioned, can it be reasonably seen by a person, a reasonable person, to have been given to influence? So we discuss that with the member, and we generally come to the conclusion that the gift was acceptable. Sometimes it's not, and we require the member to return the gift when it can be returned, or to repeat the gift when it has been consumed already. So grosso modo, that's the issue. You come to us, we assess together whether it meets the test in Section 14 of the code, so that you can actually keep it, and if not, we take measures.
Can some examples be provided of times where you have required the gift to be returned? Is it when the amount is over 200, or is it just because the perception of that particular gift is
the amount, the acceptability
Mr.
does
Dion?
not. Sorry, Madam Chair. Sorry.
Thank you.
The acceptability does not relate to the value. So the issue is the same, whether it's worth $100 or $500. Can it be seen as being given to influence you unduly? If so, so the value is a factor, however. Of course, because the reasonable person might think that a gift worth $500 is more likely to sway you than a gift worth $100 or $50. So and it's only declared when it's valued at $200 or more. So members don't come usually to tell us about the gift that's valued at less than $200. They don't. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Invitations is the classical case to an event, to a show, to a banquet.
Ms. Hoda?
Previously, there was confusion. Ms. Dawson had been at this committee stating that even gifts under 200 should be declared. They just would not be recorded or, reported. So that is not your understanding then?
Mr. Dion?
Madam Chair, my understanding is that they're not required to be declared. Sometimes people wish to discuss that with us, and that's fine, but there is no requirement to declare anything under 200.
Ms. Hoda, 30 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, I'll forego that. I can't cast the whole question in 30 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will go to the next round. 5 minutes to Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dion, for being here. I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak at committee, and thankfully, as a two-year member of Parliament, I haven't had to deal with you too much other than committee, which is probably a good thing. I want to speak a little bit. We've had different questions about training and the proactiveness of making sure members are aware of the code. I just want to focus in on the other half a little bit, and I think you may have addressed this to a certain extent, but I just want to get your views on this. When there is a contravention or report that recommends something, I guess I can kind of, it would be specifically to the code today or the act, what is there any, there's no mandatory, obviously, but what do you do for compliance, making sure that the individual member or persons who found in violation, that they are aware and don't break the code again? What process, is there any formal process in place?
Mr. Dion?
Well, Madam Chair, there is no formal process in chair. It's still rare that we conduct inquiries into the conduct of members of parliament. I was looking at the list. In the last 4 years I've been there, we've had a total of 7 inquiries, and only 7. And in those cases, I only recommended a sanction once, which was to apologize to the House, which was done by the member in question. So there is, and we do deal with every complaint sent to us by a member of parliament religiously. We study it very carefully, quickly. We have a certain number of days under the code to review it. But it's good because it sees that the vast majority of MPs do not encounter any difficulties in not contravening the code. And we also monitor social media. Sometimes we learn stuff through social media without an MP having complained about anything.
Mr. Duncan?
Yeah, and I think one of the things to build on that is that there's been one in that case of having some sort of part, and I think this is why a review would be good to look at both the pre and post education aspects of things, is a protocol or a formal process in place that if somebody isn't found, or even if a report is issued and perhaps nothing is found, that an education be done about why it was done or things that the member could do in reaction to it. And I guess that would be both for the code and for the act that way, but I think it speaks volumes as to why, I think a review would be needed. Just to go to that, and Mr. Calkins, I'm glad he did some follow-up on that too about, the foundations of the code, the code are good. So it's not critical in the sense that there's major gaps. But when you listed earlier with Mr. Broussard, you have ideas, some suggestions for improvements to the code. Can we get an idea? I mean, I'm not going to hold you to a number in the bullet points, but are you talking numerous small changes? How many are you talking about in context, just for us to understand that? I won't say if, I'll say when it's a matter of the review, the mandatory review. How many changes do you see yourself recommending?
Mr. Dion?
I currently have, Madam Chair, less than 10 on my list of so-called substantive changes. And I could easily produce a long list of what I call technical changes, in which I have more limited interest, but which would still be useful to consider.
Mr. Duncan?
And then building on that, in the engagements with your office in terms of outreach you do, I would say with stakeholders or other experts in this field, do you think there will be other stakeholders from across the country, academics, experts with background that will be recommending other changes? Have you had a lot of correspondence or outreach to your office with suggestions further than your own?
Mr. Dion?
Not many, Madam Chair, but I know we have a few, I call them constant observers who have a keen interest, especially in academia, keen interest in issues related to ethics, parliamentary ethics. And I am sure that there would be several individuals who would be interested to contribute to a review, such as this one.
Mr. Duncan, 48 seconds.
That's all I need. Thank you.
That's it. Thank you. We will move on with 5 minutes to Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, I will put some questions to Mr. Thion. Mr. Thion, I certainly don't envy you, your position, your work, since I've been in politics. One of the jobs, that I had before I was here in the private sector was the role of a commissioner of conflicts of interest for a pharmaceutical company, and so I do to some extent understand the difficulties of the role that you're playing. And I feel that most MPs, indeed likely all MPs, take you very seriously and take your role seriously, and we all do our best to respect the Act and the Code. Mr. Dion, and Madam Chair, if I may put this question through you to Mr. Dion, about friends. it may be very relevant to broaden our interpretation, our definition, to include friends. As you know, all MPs have friends. There isn't a single member of parliament who doesn't have a considerable network throughout their ridings and even throughout the country. So what sort of limits would you want to put on a new definition? How would you frame it were we to carry through on your recommendation to include friends in the definition? Mr. Dion. Madam Chair. With regard to the Act, I did in Report Trudeau 3 and Marneau 2 address the issue of the interpretation of the words friends or adding friends as a definition, how much you see the person, how long the relationship has lasted, since when you know them, do you go to the person's private home alone or in a group? These are the types of indicators, the types of signs of friendship. Because, of course, we all have our own personal definition of what a friend is. Some of us feel that we have 4,000 friends on Facebook, and others will say that they have only 2 or 3 people who are true friends throughout their lifetime. So very difficult to say what a friend is, to interpret the word friends. My tendency would be to have a very tight definition, restrictive definition of the word friends, so that it would play a real role. There, of course, has to be a threshold. You know, we couldn't have so many of them that the definition or the interpretation of the word friends becomes ridiculous. You yourselves, of course, are able as easily as I to think about who a friend is. Mr. Fergus. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Dion, for that answer. A question of a philosophical nature. Is transparency of the utmost importance, or, let me put it this way, is transparency what weighs in most heavily in your interpretation? Let's take me as an example. I am a member of parliament representing the national capital here. I've been here for around 33 years living in this area, and we often say that those who are actually from Ottawa are rare. Many people, of course, come to our capital and then go back to their ridings. Many of my friends, people whom I consider to be my friends, work in government relations, in government positions at various levels. So is transparency what is the most important factor in an interpretation? Mr. Dion, you have 35 seconds. Madam Chair, it's a mixture of factors. Often in the definition of the Act, it's anyone who holds as an appointed official, elected or otherwise, will have a list of people with whom they feel they should not interact given how close their relationship is. So yes, transparency plays an important role because it allows us to make links, to see the links. So-and-so was a friend of so-and-so. Everyone knows Mr. Fergus has asked his staff to ensure that he never gets involved in a file involving Mr. X. If that's clear, then you know ahead of time that that's the case. And at other times, if there's a complaint, I could see if that type of relationship exists with this other person at issue. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Running nicely on time and tight. Okay, I would like to be able to give both the Mr. Terrien and Ms. Blaney 5 minutes rather than 2.5 minutes. Any concerns? Mr. Terrien, à vous 5 minutes. Merci.
Mr. Terrien, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to my colleagues for this extra 2.5 minutes. I hardly know what to do with it. I'm so thrilled to have it and to have Mr. Dion here with us, visiting us. Mr. Dion, I think that Mr. Fergus had, or Madam Chair, through the chair, I'm sorry, I feel that Mr. Dion has been very kind to us because this is a very difficult role to be playing. I listen to him here and I see that his task is Herculean, how to manage, how to function, how to keep an office up and running using the interpretations of the Act. It's somewhat nebulous sometimes, the types of friends, the types of links, the family. Why aren't mothers and fathers, part of the nuclear family? Why not brothers and sisters? So you must play the role of a judge, much like King Solomon had to in a very difficult situation. Do you find, and my two questions refer to time and the passage of time. First, do you think that the code is becoming more and more concrete, more and more detailed and about reality? Are you hemmed in? I'm not saying your judgment isn't good, but do you think that there's less and less interpretation allowed and that you must be very precise respecting the letter of the Act? Mr. Dion. Well, I think that over time, I did mention some of the sort of jurisprudence in the past. What we look at is the jurisprudence that helps us give advice and that helps us make decisions in our inquiry reports. I would like to be able to publish some of these matters. At present, under the code, I'm not able to. I've mentioned that. So yes, over time, we have become more and more exact, if you wish, accurate. But there are thousands of issues. It's difficult to know ahead of time what the right response will be. It depends on so many facts. Mr. Terrien, so what you're saying is that you base your decisions on jurisprudence when there is a decision to be made. Am I correct? Mr. Dion? Madam Chair, I was speaking of course, the office's jurisprudence, if you wish, as well as the very few cases of actual law coming down to us from the courts. Yes, that's what I'd understood. Another question. I'm not sure whether, given the internet, social media, and so forth, your task is becoming more complex. Whether the new environment makes your job a little bit more complex. Mr. Dion. Well, Madam Chair, I think that actually our work is becoming simpler because we're working in an environment of greater transparency. There was a photo, for example, recently. You can get a photo that gives you an extra tool to work with, public sources, everything that's in the public realm. And we consider these matters to see whether there are any possibilities of helping an MP or even suggesting changes. This improves our work. We are more transparent. The whole situation is more transparent. Of course, we don't believe everything we see in social media on Facebook, but sometimes it gives us an in. Mr. Terrien, my last question. According to you, where in the code, give us one example of something in the code that is the least precise and that we really should hem in, that we should address because it leads to really serious problems when it comes to your applying it and judging situations. Mr. Terrien, I think that the issue of friends is a very interesting question and it's a central issue, and it's not well defined. And my very, very last question, how about family? Will you want to address the interpretation of the word family? No. Not as things are going now, unless the committee or any other interested party, such as MPs, and you might consult MPs or prior MPs, former MPs, to see what they think, whether they think anything isn't working. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dion.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. This conversation continues to interest me. If I could ask Mr. Dion through you, one of the things that we are seeing happily in the House of Commons is an increasing level of diversity within the members that represent the different ridings of Canada. And, I'm wondering if Mr. Dion has any feedback that he'd like to share on how that might impact some of these things. that members are faced with. And I also think about that when we talk about, as the conversation is here today, about family and about friends, and how do we define that? And so I can't help but think of, in my family from Stelacco First Nation, if you are an older cousin, you are an auntie or an uncle. There's all of these very clear roles that you play, but it's not necessarily. And I always find it interesting when people ask me, well, what are they really? Is it like your third cousin 3 times removed? And none of that matters. That's just not how family is decided. And so I just want to recognize that in different cultures, family, the definition of family can be very different. And of course, I would assume that at some point that would have a bit of an impact in how we look at these things. And then the other thing that I can't help but reflect on is the fact that for many folks and many stories that I've heard from the LGBTQ2 plus community, they talk about chosen family. And I think these are things to think about as we're speaking about this. Who defines what family is, what role that person is in your cohort, and how do we define friends? So I'm just wondering, as we have these discussions, if there's been thought that your office, I can't imagine it wouldn't has put into that, and if that's something that if we were to look at this department, we should be exploring further.
Mr. Dion?
So, Madam Chair, first of all, we already have some diversity within the office. We are looking at, we did a survey to determine, because it's important to reflect the population of those we serve, MPs and public officials, and more and more it's diversified. We've taken measures of, for example, not to correspond with an MP or with a public official when we know it's a religious holiday in his or her religion, as a gesture of respect, essentially. The same way we would not send somebody a letter informing them that they will be investigated on December 25th. We will not send it on a Sikh holiday or on the Jewish holiday or such holiday. So that's a small thing, but it's one example. And I must admit that the member has opened my eyes, however, to the fact that when the definition of family was crafted, it was crafted in 2004 or before 2004, and it does not reflect any attempt to try to reflect the non-traditional family, the concept of a non-traditional family. And that's another area where we could look at, the committee could look at with our assistance to see whether we can modernize the definition as well.
Ms. Blaney?
Well, thank you for that. I think that's an important conversation that we definitely need to be having over the next number of years as we become more holistic in our approach. Let's put it that. So thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to have that moment of a question. So I guess the next question, and I promise this is my last one. I only have about 2.5 minutes, and I know we have a lot of important business to do in this room, Madam Chair. But I guess one of the questions that I have and hope to have some clarity around is, with the role that Mr. Dion holds right now, I've heard numerous conversations today about how that role is limited and how sometimes it almost sounds like that could be a little bit frustrating. And I can't help but reflect on the fact that we've had members in this place talk about public confidence, and really appreciated Mr. Dion's comments that not only is that happening in Canada where people are feeling less of a sense of public confidence, but that's happening across the planet, and is something that we should all be reflecting on, especially as politicians and parliamentarians. So I'm just wondering if Mr. Dion has any response to the idea of does this office have the level of power required to properly implement the role, but also within that lens of how do we increase public confidence within these roles that we all hold here.
Thanks, Ms. Blaney. I think your clock might have been off by a minute, so there's...
Oh, sorry.
We'll let Mr. Dion respond, though.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, it's a very complex and important question that's being asked. I was asked about level of resources. Initially, I answered a certain way. Level of power is a different thing. It's entirely different. And I was appointed. One of my training is that of a lawyer, My role is to implement the code and the act as they exist, not as I wish they would exist. And at the appropriate time, I will be making suggestions because it is obvious that there's a lot of room for improving the impact that the office can have on the actual long-term situation of Canadians' confidence in their public institutions. We could have more power, but for the time being, we don't have more power, and I'm trying to make the best out of the situation that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Dion. And the last round, 5 minutes, Mr. Gerritsen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Mr. Dion. You know, excuse me, I want to try to play the devil's advocate for a couple of issues here. You know, when we talk about relooking at the definition of family or the inclusion of friends, I mean, at the end of the day, is there not some concern that we end up opening things up in such a way as to create more problem or more inconsistencies or more confusion? I realize the desire for it. But at the end of the day, a certain degree of responsibility, in my opinion, needs to be placed upon the individual to do what is right. And if somebody wants to neglect to do what is right, in my opinion, they'll always find a way to do that. And so my question through you, Madam Chair, would be, does Mr. Dion share the same concern that if you start to amend definitions and include friends, close friends, and try to define what a close friend is versus an acquaintance, don't you start to run the risk of, one, getting away from this principle of putting onus on somebody to do what's right, and run the risk of perhaps, you know, creating more confusion down the road?
Mr. Dion?
I'm sure there's always that risk. Whenever you, the definition we currently have has the benefit of being simple, easy to apply for the family. Friends are not included in the code, so there is no complexity. It's simply not on the list of the immediate.
They're not now, but sorry, Mr. Dion, they're not through you, Madam Chair. They're not now, but there's been a lot of discussion today about the possibility of adding that, and that's what my question was to him.
So, Mr.
Through you, Madam Chair, you know, I kind of take the same approach as it relates to training. You know, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that I heard Mr. Dion say that he was perhaps in support of mandatory training. If someone chooses not to do the training and then is found to be in violation, I mean, isn't that the product of their own, you know, mistake? I mean, at what point do we start to say perhaps less is more?
We're going to let Mr. Dion respond.
Yeah,
I'll bring you back to the floor.
Well, that's a good point as well. And in fact, you know, training could be mandatory and people could attend and be absent-minded. And we're talking about virtual training, so you can shut off the camera and go to the washroom and nobody will know. But at least it would be a step in the right direction. You know, when we have attendance rates of 7% of MPs, I am not very happy with having gone through the trouble of creating a curriculum for 93% of the MPs who do not attend. Members of their staff do attend, but you know, in my view, I think MPs in general should pay a little bit more personal attention to these things. Sometimes they're not.
Sorry. Finish your thought, Mr. Dion.
Sometimes they're not being as well served as they would be if they paid a little bit more attention.
Mr.
Through you, Madam Chair. Now I lost my train of thought because the chair was lecturing me. She's doing a great job, though. You are doing a great job because you would be the only one that I would speak to right now. So on this point, because I think that it is very important. I imagine, okay, Mr. Dion, what if you ran and were elected in the next parliament, and then someone said to you, "Oh, sir, you're going to need to do this mandatory training." It'd kind of be a little ridiculous because he would know it so well, Madam Chair. So I just, imagine there are other people who would be in a similar position. So I don't know, I don't know about making things mandatory, if that is really a step in the right direction or not. If I have any time left, Mr. Fergus wanted to ask a quick follow-up question.
30 seconds to you, Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à mon.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Gerritsen. Mr. Dion, I mentioned my prior career as involved in ethics with a private company, and one of the things we noted there was that it was too easy over time to develop this really thick kind of biblical type text of things that one just must not do. And just quickly, Madam Chair, if you allow, we shifted our style completely. We said, look, we'll shift this. The burden will be on people's own conscience. We'll have basic orders, the 10 Commandments, if you wish. We had about 11 of them, and this is what you must struggle to respect, is what we told people. Would that sort of thing make things easier, rather than having a detailed code with lists of so many things that one mustn't do? Just have a general set of principles. Mr. Dion, your response? Madam Chair, anything's possible. It's an interesting idea, interesting concept, but it's certainly not the approach that Parliament took in 2004. And we will see if the committee decides to undertake a comprehensive review under Section 33. It's the sort of thing that might be taken into consideration. Thank you, Mr. Dion.
The last thing is simply would be to thank you and the members for having spent some time this morning to discuss these matters. And I tell people at my office that my first priority, I'm an officer of the House of Commons, so whenever you call me, it is my first priority.
Was that part of the talking points, or?
And I will, no, it's not. Okay. And I will remain available at all times.
On behalf of PROC committee members and myself, I just want to say thank you to you and your team for the work that you do. Thank you for coming here. We wish you the best of the holiday season, and we look forward to continuing to work together. So
thank you very much.
We will suspend committee real quick as we move into camera.